Morning, St. Alphonsus and friends, redemptorists and relatives who are joining this conversation that we continue to sponsor here at St. Alphonsus. This conversation about growing in authentic spirituality. I hope you feel as I did that we had a good week last week. We covered a lot of ground. Hopefully it was helpful so that it could help you, as it helped me, put the discussion of spirituality into some sort of context that goes beyond what perhaps we traditionally hear or traditionally think. Continuing this week, what I would like to do is to continue to help you connect with your own human experience, because it is in human experience that we encounter our spirituality, that we encounter the divine, that we encounter the sacred. It's not something that happens in our head. It's not something that happens as a part of our imagination. It's something that happens within our human experience. And the incarnation of Jesus teaches us the importance of human experience. There was a time, as I referenced quickly last week, within our understanding of who we are as spiritual beings, the human beings attempted to get away from the human body. They tried to master it. They tried to claim it. They tried to conquer it. Somehow believing by doing that they were becoming more spiritual. My thinking is that they probably just came more cranky, more upset, more dissatisfied. Because what they were doing was they were beating into submission the very experience, if you will, that they needed in order to encounter God. There's a difference, I think I can explain it this way. Let's think about something that's very, very simple to accomplish. Let's contrast it as simply an idea or as a human experience. And let's just choose a sunset, a wonderful sunset. And let's say that you have the best writer in the world, whatever your favorite writer is. Could be fiction writer, nonfiction writer, sports writer, any type of writer that you like, and have them use all of their talent and all of their ability to describe to you the wonderfulness of a sunset, a particular sunset. All the different colors, the hues, the smell of it, the taste of it, if you will, the feel of it, the experience of a sunset. And as wonderful as that experience is, now take exactly the same sunset, get rid of all the words, and put yourself smack in the middle of the sunset. And what's the difference? The difference is amazing. The difference is impossible to explain. It can only be experienced. The difference isn't not that the person who is writing about the sunset hasn't used all of their skill and all their ability to tell you how wonderful it is. But it pales in comparison, if you will, to actually standing there in the midst of wherever you are and experiencing the sunset itself. That's spirituality in a nutshell. Not sunsets, experience. It's one thing to be thinking about spirituality as something that happens just in your head, ideas. But something else to experience spirituality within your own human experience, within your authentic self, how you feel, how you taste, how you smell, how you imagine, how you create. Those are the tools that God has given you in order to experience the sacred, in order to experience the divine. And part of growing in a sense of spirituality is learning how to embrace your humanity. And that means embracing not only your strengths, which all of us like to embrace, but it also means embracing your weaknesses. It means not only embracing your convictions, which in spirituality is not necessarily a good thing, but it's also embracing your questions, your fears, your anxieties, your vulnerabilities. And that's where you will discover the presence of God in a way that is extremely powerful. We brought up yesterday, or Friday when we met, one example of two people who experienced God in their humanity. And those people, of course, were Abraham and Sarah, the ancestral people of our faith. And they experienced the fullness of the revelation of God exactly as they were. God came to them in a way that they could accept and understand and appreciate. And that's one of the first lessons that we learn in our first connecting points, that when you try to connect with God, when you try to make yourself aware of God, when you try to make yourself aware of the presence of God, you will discover God in a way that you are most comfortable, in a way that you are most familiar, because that is how God will be revealed to you. But as you grow, and as you develop, as you mature, your experience of God, your idea of God, changes, and it matures. And so the God, perhaps, that you have when you're 6 or 7 or 8 years old is certainly not the God that you have when you're 15 or 16 years old. It's certainly not the God that you have when you're 40 years old, or by the time you get to my age in the 60s. It's not the same God at all. It's completely different, as it should be. I sometimes chuckle in a good sense, not in a judgmental sense. I sometimes chuckle when I hear people talking about how they don't believe in God, and they start describing God, and the God that they're describing is the last time they paid attention to God when they were 12 years old, and they said that God is not good, it's incompetent, it's dead. As well it should be. If you're 40, 50, or 60 years old, a 12-year-old God is not going to be where you encounter a relationship with God. God has to be reflective of your present experience, how you understand God, how you understand yourself, how you understand the community in which you live. In a real sense, what we're doing is we're discovering the image of God. But we're not making God in our own image, because that's something, of course, we don't want to do, even though, in a sense, we do it again and again and again. A spiritually mature person lets go even of their comfortable image of God and embraces an image of God that's completely different. In our story of Sarah and Abraham, that's certainly something that happened to them. As they grew and they developed, the Yahweh that they encountered the first time was not the Yahweh that encouraged them or led them or brought them to the point of faith by the end of the story. That Yahweh is completely different. I'd like to introduce to you another character from the scripture, and one of the reasons I would like to spend some time with personalities from the scripture is because the ones that are well developed in the scripture help us understand something of what it means to be a human being, and they help us to understand how we can experience God. The next person I want to share with you is the person in the scripture that hands down the Old Testament loves more than any other person. Hands down, he emerges not only from the Old Testament, but he emerges into the New Testament as a primary character. He's the central character of our faith, the central personality, and that person is King David. And David is a fascinating person, absolutely fascinating. The scriptures love David. They consider David and all his experiences to be something that is important for all of us to encounter, to understand, to appreciate, and to learn something from. A paragraph that I wrote about King David years ago kind of sums up, I think, why he's so important. The story of King David includes this: a battle with a Philistine giant, a Goliath of a man whom he slays in the name of Yahweh. He has an intimate friendship with Jonathan, who is David's #1 advocate and friend, but later in the story suffers a tragic death at the side of his father Saul, all the while remaining loyal and faithful to David. David has marriages, some for political convenience, one for love, and seemingly one, to the infamous Bathsheba, for reasons rooted in lust, that nevertheless results in the birth of the future king, King Solomon. And threaded throughout David's story are various military escapades, plots, coup attempts, a few murders, and one spectacular display of religious piety and devotion to Yahweh. When stripped down to his bare necessities, David dances with joy and abandon before the Ark of the Covenant as it's carried into the city of Jerusalem. And so you can see in just these 100 words or so how complicated of a person David is, how full of a person, a human person, the fullness of life that David is. He experiences everything. But why is it that the scriptures love him so much? Why is he held up as an example? Why is he celebrated? I think there's a couple insights that we can look at. But one of the insights that's very important and illuminating, I think, also for our own spiritual journey, is the story that's told in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. This is the story. I know you're familiar with it. There were two men in the same city, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had huge flocks of sheep, herds of cattle. The poor man had nothing but one little female lamb, which he bought and raised. It grew up with him and his children as a member of his family. It ate off his plate, drank from his cup, slept in his bed. It was like a daughter to him. One day a traveler dropped in on the rich man, and the rich man was too stingy to take an animal from his own herds or flocks to make a meal for his visitor. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared a meal and set it before his guest. Now imagine, King David is in his throne room. He's at the height of his power. He's the great king of Israel. Nathan's a poor, bumbling prophet. And Nathan stands before David and tells him this story. And David, in his indignation, his righteous indignation, stands up and bellows that the person who did this, the rich man, is to suffer, that it's unconscionable that he would do something like this. And he demands to know who is this person who did such a terrible thing. And the prophet looks at David and says, "You are the man. You are the one." You can hear the silence. 3,000 years after the event, you can still hear the silence as Nathan points out to David, "You did it. You took Bathsheba. You took everything. You are the guilty one." David, in all of his glory and all of his power, could have had Nathan slayed on the spot. Nobody would have thought anything about it. But he doesn't. He looks at the prophet Nathan and he says, "Yes, I am the man. I'm the one who did it." And he immediately begins to repent. One of the reasons David is beloved in the scriptures is because of this story. Because he had the courage and the vulnerability, and he enjoyed an intimacy with Yahweh, that he could be so truthful, that he could stand before his court, he could stand before the prophet, he could stand before Yahweh and admit that he was wrong, that he had made a bad choice, that he was guilty of sin. A powerful king who was unaware of who he really is, who lived an inauthentic life, would have just got rid of Nathan. David did not. He took responsibility. The story continues on throughout the story of David, and there are many other examples of David's relationship with Yahweh that are important. But it's this moment at the end of his life, when David is laying in bed and is dying. And this is what he says. He says, "God is bedrock under my feet, the castle in which I live. my rescuing knight. My God, where I run for dear life, hiding behind the boulders, safe in the granite hideout. My mountaintop refuge, he saves me. I sing to God and find myself safe and saved. So at the end of David's life, when he could have claimed all sorts of wonderful things, he could have sung his praises, he could have done a variety of things. What does he do? He praises God. He thanks God. And he acknowledges that it is only in God that he realizes that all is possible and his life is complete because of God. So there in the story of David, we have some very important connecting points that are part of our spiritual journey that go beyond just what Abraham and Sarah experienced. David already knows Yahweh. He understands Yahweh from a very young age. He enters into a loving relationship with Yahweh, but he lives his life dramatically. He lives his life boldly. He lives his life sinning big, but also loving big. He lives his life forgiving big. He lives his life dramatically, but he always lives his life in reference to Yahweh, thankful for the grace and the blessings that Yahweh has given him. And as a result, he lives his life authentically anchored in the Lord. So that teaches us something about our own spiritual journey, our own spiritual life, how we can enter fully into life, how we can bring our strengths and also our weaknesses before God, but remain always in God, remain always faithful to God, and God will remain faithful to us. Another person that I choose to reflect on during this time to help us understand what it's like to become a full human being, an authentic human being, and understand and enter into a relationship with God is in the person of Mary of Magdala. In the Christian scriptures, in the New Testament of the Christian scriptures, Mary Magdala is very much present. She is a woman from Galilee who is known as Mary of Magdala or Mary Magdalene. And in the first reading, sometimes of her story, we might not completely understand her importance. But she is certainly someone who meets Jesus as a man, who is attracted to Jesus as a man. And as her spiritual journey and her relationship with Jesus continues, she transforms that initial relationship into something much more than just being in love or being caring about him. She learns as she walks with Jesus and as she lives with Jesus what it means to truly love. But she also learns what it means to let go of something that is so very, very important and so very, very life-giving and so very, very fearful to let go of it. But in the letting go of it, to discover something more. And perhaps it's appropriate that this story is during Holy Week, even though it kind of anticipates the Feast of Easter. But nonetheless, it tells us a little bit about the story of Magdala. And here it is. It comes from the Gospel of John. Mary stands outside the tomb weeping. And as she weeps, she kneels to look into the tomb and sees two angels sitting there, dressed in white, one at the head, the other at the foot, where Jesus' body had been laid. They said to her, "Woman, why do you weep?" "They took my master," she said, "and I don't know where they put him." After she had said this, she turned away and saw Jesus standing there, but didn't recognize him. Jesus spoke to her, "Woman, why do you weep? Who are you looking for?" Mary, thinking that he was the gardener, said, "Master, if you took him, tell me where you put him, so I can care for him." And Jesus said, "Mary." And turning to face him, she said, "Teacher." And then Jesus said, "Don't cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go to my brothers and tell them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went telling the news to the disciples. I saw the Master. And she told him everything that he had said to her. Don't cling to me, Jesus said. Mary recognized his voice immediately. It was the man that she loved, that she cared for, that she had devoted her life to. Every impulse within her was an impulse to touch him, to grab him, to hold on to him, to cling to him. But if she did that, she never would transform. She never would grow in her spiritual life. She had to let go of the historical Jesus that she knew and permit the risen Christ to come into her life. How much of a transformation do you think it would be to let go of the historical Jesus and to permit the risen Christ to come into your life? But yet that is what Mary did. Her story teaches us the same thing that we have to do. We too have to let go. Abraham and Sarah had to learn a new way. They had to react in a different way. They had to choose different things. They had to live in a different way when they encountered Jesus, or not Jesus, when they encountered Yahweh. David had to do the same thing. And here in this story, Mary of Magdalene does the same thing. You learn, you change, you develop. And in the process, God reveals himself more and more to you in a very powerful way. The last person that I'm going to bring up is the Apostle Paul. And we could spend literally the rest of the week talking about the Apostle Paul. I've read many, many books about Paul. Paul fascinates me. He fascinates me because he comes from such a complicated experience of life. He comes from a place of total surety. He comes from a place of total conviction and abandons all that and embraces something bigger than himself, changes something that he doesn't even think is possible to change. And he becomes not just a believer, but he becomes the ultimate believer, if you will. So that's always been something that I have found to be very interesting, very inviting, and very dramatic. There's also, and I'll admit this, when I read about Paul, there's also things about Paul that I just don't like. I have a feeling that if I was in the same room with Paul, I would probably be irritated by him. He's pretty irritating. He has a way of getting under people's skin. He has a way of poking people in a way that you can't even begin to imagine. But yet that's partly who he is. And I think probably that's, when he talks about his cross, I think that's his cross. I think his cross is, his prayer to Jesus is, help me not be so obnoxious. But it's part of who he is. So those of us who are obnoxious can find a saint in Paul to help us understand what our relationship with God is. But at any rate, Paul has to let go of everything again. And this is something that is told in the scriptures by Paul himself a couple of times. But the fullness of it is kind of glossed over. When we tell the story of Paul's conversion, it feels like it goes on just like that. But if you pay attention to the story, if you actually read the story, you understand that it was a process, a slow process. Paul had to let go of everything that he thought he knew, and in the process accept something different into his life. And I can imagine the arguments he must have had with himself, the real struggle that he must have had, the sleepless nights that he must have had, as he let go of everything that he thought was essential for his own life and salvation, and then had the courage to embrace a different vision, a different life, a different relationship. And I think that that's partly the reason why sometimes when you read Paul, that there's a frantic energy around Paul. There's a frantic anxiety that's around Paul. He just talks nonstop. And I think it's because he realizes he doesn't have as much time as he would like. And at the same time, he's just so filled with enthusiasm for what he's experienced that he can't wait to tell you and he can't wait to share with you. But at any rate, we understand in Paul the experience of moving from something that you are convinced that you need to embracing something that perhaps you don't even know that you need. And in the process, you come to a real change in your life. I think Paul teaches us not only theology. It would be terrible to just leave Paul's experience as a theological experience. I think Paul teaches us something about trust also. But the point that I would like to leave with you this morning is he also teaches us something about intimacy. Intimacy with Jesus and intimacy with his relationship with the Lord. And I think it be found in that famous passage of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 to 7. I think it's descriptive of Paul, but perhaps it's also descriptive of each and every one of us. Love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head, doesn't force itself on others, isn't always me first, doesn't fly off the handle, doesn't keep scores of the sins of others, doesn't revel when others grovel, takes pleasure in the flowering of truth, puts up with anything, trusts God always, always looks for the best, never looks back, but keeps going to the end. I think that's a descriptive of Paul's ongoing relationship with Jesus, the fullness of Jesus' life and love that takes root in Paul's life and changes him and helps him to connect with something bigger than himself. And in the process of connecting with something bigger than himself, to become aware of who he is. He lists all these things, all of which he is intimately familiar with, the behaviors that he doesn't like about himself, and all those other things that have other people would say about him. And in the midst of all that, he agrees with it, he acknowledges it, but then says, love changes it. And the love that I have for Jesus and the love that Jesus has for me changes me. So that's a wonderful prayer to end our time together this morning, to go back to 1 Corinthians ourselves, chapter 13, and read the wonderful hymn to love, the wonderful hymn to transformation, to intimacy, to truthfulness, and to vulnerability, all of which we see exhibit in the lives of Sarah and Abraham, we see experienced in the life of King David, we see demonstrated to us powerfully in the life of Mary Magdalene, and then finally in the life of Paul the Apostle. God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow morning.